Gluten Abend, everybody. Today I'm super excited because we have a special guest, Karl de Smedt, also known as the Sourdough Librarian. Hi, Karl. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Henrik.
Where in the world are you right now?
Well, as you can see, this is not a virtual background. I am in the Sourdough Library.
And that's a real forest top.
When we made the Sourdough Library, we sent a photographer into the woods to take a picture on his back on the floor of the trees. And then we made it on a canvas, and then we have a lot of LED lights against the roof, and then the canvas is like illuminated.
Ah, that's amazing.
These lights. And so I am located in what we call the Center for Bread Flavor, which is an expertise place of Purados, the company I work for. We are in the eastern part of Belgium, close to the 4 kilometers from the German border, actually, in the Eifel. And voila, this is the one and only Sourdough Library in the world.
And I have a video here of you in the Sourdough Library. Let me put that up here on the screen.
All right, I'm curious. I was doing trials with reels. I discovered reels on Instagram, and I tried to do something fun.
And so the Sourdough Library, what exactly does that mean? Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes. So the Sourdough Library is from the company. It is our contribution. It's a non-for-profit initiative to contribute to do three things. To contribute to the world of fermentation and fermentation technology in general. And therefore, we safeguard the biodiversity of sourdough. We protect the heritage of sourdough. And we offer a backup to the people who give their sourdough to the library project so that we can study them. So these are the three things we do here in the library.
And how many sourdoughs would you say you have by now in the library?
For the moment, we have 133 sourdoughs that have been attributed. There is a couple of them. There is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 are missing in the collection, but I have the latest one is 133 minus 6. That is the amount of sourdoughs we have here for the moment physically present in the library.
So what's the end game? How many sourdoughs do you want to have inside of your library?
Well, there is no limit. There is the limit of budget, for instance. Right now, I can enter between 20 and 25 starters per year. But in space, there is no limitation because it's the library, it's the showroom. But if my library is full, I can always reduce the size of the jars, fill up the fridges with more. And if that is even not sufficient, I can just add an extra room where I keep them refrigerated. And like in a library, you have the books that are exposed, and then they have the attic and the basement that are filled with books, and they do like a kind of rotation system. So there is no limits in the amount of starters I can enter in this project.
That's super awesome. And just maybe for everybody who's not so much into sourdough baking yet, maybe you could just briefly explain how a sourdough in general works. What's so special about a sourdough?
Okay, well, the first thing that is special is that it is a product that has an heritage for more than 5,000 years. Wherever on earth people wanted to make bread, like we do it today, based on fermentation and baked in an oven, they were using sourdough. So we know for sure that the Egyptians mastered already the art of fermentation, but there is evidence that breads were baked already 8,000, 14,000, and lately I discovered that in Australia, they found traces of baked breads that date back to 18,000 years. Now, what does it do? There is two things. First of all, you have the yeasts in the sourdough, and they contribute to the fermentation power. So they will make the bread rise, give it a nice volume, make it fluffy, make it airy. And then you have the lactic acid bacteria that are tremendously present in a sourdough, and they take care of the digestion, if I can say so, of the flour. Because the human body is not designed to consume or to digest flour. You need lactic acid bacteria. And luckily in our intestine, we have an abundance of lactic acid bacteria, but the time a bread is in our intestinal tract is actually too short to digest it completely. So if you have a sourdough, your digestion starts already in the sourdough during the fermentation process. It stopped during the baking, and it starts again when the bread is consumed by humans. That's what sourdough's most beautiful contribution is. When you have bread made with sourdough, you increase the nutritional value of the bread, and you increase the digestion of your bread so that your body can absorb the full potential of the bread, making it a perfect bread for people who are intolerant to gluten. I am not saying those are really celiac, they should avoid anything that is related to gluten, but for people with IBS, it is a perfect solution to consume bread without any problems. That's the beauty about sourdough.
And so is that a little bit similar to sometimes when you buy cheese in Germany, it would say naturally lactose free. Is that a little bit like with sourdough, that over time it's just so much broken down that it becomes free of some of the ingredients?
Well, free, it will never be free of gluten, but the lactic acid bacteria during the fermentation, they will convert actually your gluten network that is present. They will convert that into amino acids. And the amino acids are actually building blocks for our body. But it will not be free of gluten.
So that's just an example, for instance, when you bake a sourdough bread, sometimes when you ferment your bread for too long, at least the wheat-based bread, it just starts breaking down. It becomes very sticky.
Yes.
Is that the cause of this?
That's one of the causes, yeah. Because, the gluten network is like a balloon. When these proteins that are present in the flour, they start to bind and they create the balloon that is retaining the gas that is produced by the yeast. But when, on the other hand, the lactic acid bacteria, they consume this gluten network, so your balloon is getting holes, and you can blow air inside to keep that balloon growing. But if the holes become too big and your gas production is getting too low, then your balloon deflates, and that's when the bread is what we call overproofed, and then you have it's misery in the house. Then you can make pizzas out of it.
So is that actually a bad thing that the bread is overproofed? It won't retain its structure, but it should still be good to be baked inside a loaf pan, for instance, or?
Yeah, but still, when the bread is starting to collapse, it's not pleasant to eat it anymore, Nigel,
okay.
Because your crumb texture will not be nice. And no, it's
okay.
Everything has its optimal, and it should be consumed within that range.
Okay, awesome. So my next question, I think you already answered the first part of it, but then the second part of the question, what's the Center for Bread Flavor? Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yes. So the whole site where I am is the Center for Bread Flavor is just in front of the building where we started in 1994 to produce our sourdoughs that we sell commercially in the market. Now, in 2002, a couple of investors of the city of St. Vith, they decided to build a golf course. But the golf course was not very successful, but the building was beautiful with a restaurant, meeting rooms, a kitchen, beautiful place. And it was for us an ideal location. When customers from all over the world came to visit the factory, we had actually no room where we could sit with them together and talk about their future and their desires and the co-creation we can do with them. And as such, we started to rent in 2008. We started to rent the building. In the meantime, we bought it. It belongs to us. And we converted it in the Center for Bread Flavor. And what we do here is inspire customers. We get here approximately, in normal times, 2,000 visitors per year. Customers from the largest bakeries in the world to small bakeries, journalists, trade press, schools, universities, people come here to discover the beauty of sourdough, the secrets of sourdough. They come to see the library. We have on the site the Maison du Levain, which is more a museum where we talk about the past, the present, and where we take customers to the future of bread. And yeah, it's an amazing place where extraordinary things happen related to bread and bread baking, sourdough bread baking.
So you yourself also have a background as a baker, right?
I was trained here in Belgium as a baker, a pâtissier, chocolatier, ice cream maker, and candy maker. When I left school in '88, I worked 6 years as a confectioner in a patisserie in Brussels, because confectionery was my big love, because it's a fine art of combining flavors, creating stuff, be creative. But then when I decided, actually, the owner of that bakery wanted to sell me his bakery, and I wanted to buy it, but my wife didn't want to. She's a teacher, and she preferred to teach instead of being the owner of a bakery. And so I decided to choose for my wife, and I decided to enter in Purados because it's a worldwide company. We are present all over the world, and in the bakery business, patisserie and chocolate, we are leaders. And as such, I entered as a test baker in the laboratory, and I discovered my very first sourdough. And I knew the basics of baking, but I never seen a sourdough in my life. I didn't learn in school what sourdough was and how to bake with it, let's say, to make one. And I discovered a starter that we collected. A colleague of mine in those days, he retired last year, Paul de Pauw, amazing guy from the long-term research department. And he brought back, I will take it. I will actually take it. He brought this starter from San Francisco. It's number 43 in the collection. And this is the starter that I refreshed, I fed for the first time, and I baked my first sourdough bread with it. And it was like a new world opening. Like seeing what this thing was capable of. And I got interest in the science behind bread. And I tried to understand what is happening actually? What is happening during the mixing? What is ongoing during that fermentation? How is sourdough contributing to that? What does it do when you bake with it? All these things. And that's where I got interested in the science behind baking. And as such, over the years, well, I ended up here in the Center for Bread Flavor. I'm responsible for the place, and I'm fully dedicated to increase the awareness of sourdough in the market, to bring a positive message about bread and the contribution of sourdough to healthy or to better breads. So I found the job of my life, actually.
That's amazing. And I stalked your Instagram account a little bit, and I saw this bread. Is this your personal favorite sourdough bread?
Well, it's one of, this is from my Instagram, I think, and it's a whole grain bread that I bake at home. And this one, was made with 100% freshly milled wheat berries, and I use the combination. If my souvenir is correct, there was some kamut inside, some emmer, some einkorn. I see that I use use pumpkin, sunflower, poppy seeds, sesame seeds, linseeds. It's stuffed with grains and seeds, and it's a bread that I actually, I like that very much. Now, is it my favorite? That's difficult to say, because I have a wide appreciation for all kinds of breads. That can be focaccias, it can be the bagel, it can be a pretzel, it can be a pizza, it can be very nice rye bread or fluffy breads, like you find them sometimes in Japan. It's difficult to say which bread is my favorite.
So based on out of different categories, I would be very curious to hear your thoughts. I mean, it's hard to say because there are different categories. But let's say for a bread like the one that I've just shown you, what's the perfect sourdough bread in your opinion? What does it need to have? Which flavors?
I think the perfect sourdough bread is not existing yet. I think it's not existing. I think that we are rediscovering sourdough bread. We are where winemakers were 50 years ago. We still have so much to discover about sourdough because it has disappeared from our daily lives a bit more than 150 years ago. In the entire history of humans, sourdough was used in order to produce breads. There was no alternative. Here and there, you saw that bakers were experimenting with brewer's yeast, the leftover of the beer production. There is records that in the early 19th century, Germany was exporting tremendous amounts of brewer's yeast to the UK because they wanted fluffy bread, no acid bread. Acid bread in human history has never been appreciated until some people started to create a buzz about it. There is record from books in France from 1778 from Augustin Parmentier, who says, un levain ne doit pas être aigre, meaning a sourdough should not be sour, or a sourdough bread should not be sour. And bakers were, in those days, in order to avoid that sourness, bakers were refreshing their starter every 4 hours. And as such, could not sleep longer than 3 hours and a half. There is legends that said that bakers were sleeping with their sourdough under their mattress. And when the sourdough was rising, they would roll out of bed and they knew it was time to get to work or to feed the dough. So a lot of knowledge has been lost when Louis Pasteur wrote his PhD on alcoholic fermentation and opened actually the way to the production of industrially produced baker's yeast. And that, in those days, was like a miracle product. Bakeries open, they were like, what an amazing thing do I get here? It's a compressed yeast, which helps me to make a lot of bread, a lot of consistency in the bread. I can make more breads in less time, earning more money. So it was well appreciated. And they stopped producing their sourdough. They just forgot it. And we haven't looked into sourdough for many years. We are in the sourdough business since 1985. We started to do research, and we start little by little to understand. And with this project, we try to understand it even better because we want to reintroduce it into bread baking for the future. But saying what is the perfect sourdough bread for the moment, I think it's not existing yet. There might be nice breads, but having the perfect sourdough bread is probably not for the next 10, 20 years.
That's super interesting. There was a question from Michael here on the chat. What about fruit water yeast?
Oh, this has been a buzz a couple of years ago. In 2014, I went to Greece to collect a starter from Amphilochia. And that starter was made with holy water. And the holy water was coming from the day that they celebrate in the Greek Orthodox religion, they celebrate Stavros. And Stavros means the cross of Christ. And that cross was found back in 360 and something by Saint Helena, and it was covered with basil leaves. Now, what happens that day is that the women, when they go to church, they bring basil, they drop it on the altar, and the priest has a vessel with water where he takes the cross with Jesus Christ, he enrobes it with basil, and he dips it into the water, and then he uses it to make everybody wet in the church, and that water is contaminated with the microorganisms from the basil. So it's a kind of fruit yeast water. Now we made that movie, and a lot of people started to get interest. And then there was on Facebook a couple of people who experimented with raisins, because the traditional recipe is you take raisins, you soak them in water, you let it ferment, and that water you use in order to start up your sourdough, or you grate an apple. So people, and that's the beauty about social media, is that a lot of people can contribute to one idea in many different ways. People started to ferment rosemary. People start rose petals. I have a friend, Seor Guy Frankel in Los Angeles. Maybe some of you know him. He started to do a lot of experiments, and we exchanged ideas, and I set up a bunch of experiments. Now the risk, we've done a little bit of research, because I was speaking about this. I said to my colleagues of microbiology, of our long-term research, I said, ladies, there is this fruit water, and it's nice, and we did some experiments. Now the risk with this fruit water, it can work fantastically, but you have to pay attention, because you do not know what you develop in that fruit water. It can go great, and luckily bread is baked in the oven, so the risk is limited, but there is always the risk, because in that water you ferment stuff, but you should make sure that whenever you use something that is food safe, the pH should be below 4.1. Because then all pathogens are killed. But what is happening during that fermentation, and I don't know if you know a little bit about kombucha fermentation, but if your kombucha fermentation is not going in the right direction, you can also produce a lot of mycotoxins. And these mycotoxins are very harmful for us. It's not a good thing to have. So in fruit water, you can have microorganisms that you do not want to have there, and you can produce a lot of these mycotoxins.
Okay, so that's where then the sourdough is beneficial, because you are lowering the pH at some point to kill all the pathogens.
If you want to do something with that fruit water, use it in order to start up a sourdough. Add flour to it and let it acidify. Let the good lactic acid bacteria do their job, bring the pH down below 4.1, and then it's safe to use the fruit water without any problems.
Oh, I think that's such a great tip, because I've been seeing so many people do that, and I also wondered myself. And I think the combination of both worlds, yeah, that's working very well. Awesome. I have another question from Jan Peter here from the channel. It's a little bit more about bread baking. And the question is, if I summarize that, what do you think, what are the factors to decide that the sourdough bread is done with the fermentation? Are there tips that you can give hobby bakers? Because I think it's also always very hard to judge. Is my bread actually done with a bulk fermentation or not? How do you do that?
Well, I think that is experimenting. If there is one thing I can say about sourdough, is that and what we've seen here in this library, is that each sourdough is unique. There is not two sourdoughs here that have the same constellation, that have the same consortium of microorganisms. There is many strains of yeasts that are present in the sourdoughs. Some of them is the typical, the most present one is the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the baker's yeast. But there is so many variations within that species, like saying it's a dog, but you don't know if it's a poodle or if it's a German shepherd, okay? And so defining when is in time, that's already impossible. So you have to feel that. When you start sourdough baking, you have to start recording what you do. Take pictures, describe feelings, measure heights, touch with your finger. The rules that apply to yeast baking, where you touch your finger and when you touch the dough and it has to come back and your print of your finger has to remain softly there, and that with sourdough is not fully working the same time. With yeast, you have a different behavior of the dough when you have lactic acid bacteria. It's as such, I don't know what Jan Willem or Jan Hendrik or Jan Peter van den Wittenboer, he must be from the Netherlands probably.
From Friesland.
From Friesland, voilà. So it's North Netherlands.
Hello, Jan Peter.
Fries. So it's difficult to determine and to give advice actually about sourdough. That's what makes me always a bit reluctant when I see people sharing methods and things to do. It's not valid for everyone, because someone can have a sourdough with a ratio of 1 yeast for 50 lactic acid bacteria for 100 lactic acid bacteria, which is described in literature as being the standard. But we've seen big deviations here. So very difficult to say. And one day your sourdough can contain a lot of yeasts, and 3 days later, the yeasts might have disappeared and it might be full of lactic acid bacteria. And the time you invest in the bulk might be, you might need 3 times more, or you will never reach that level of bulk fermentation anymore, because your sourdough is just become something completely different. That's the complexity. Making sourdough is very simple. Mixing flour and water. How difficult can it be? Everybody can do that. But then once starting to deal with that, it's like making children. Making a kid is easy. Everybody can do that. But having pleasure making them is already another thing. And then make it grow up. Go through all these phases with the maternity, and then the puberty and adolescence, and getting older and older and older. We evolve, and your sourdough behaves differently any moment of the year.
That's super interesting. I have a follow-up question related to an earlier question, which was related to the center of bread flavor. And then my question would be, what do large bakeries sometimes do to enhance the flavor of their bread? And I'm also interested in, by what you now describe, it seems almost to be impossible to make an industrial process out of sourdough, because it's so unique, right? How can you set up a factory where the flour, the sourdough, always behaves exactly the same? That sounds like such a complicated process.
It's a very good question, actually. Well, you live in Germany, okay? Germany is the country on earth where you find the most sourdoughs. Almost every bakery is using sourdough. Now, what the Germans know is that in order to produce sourdough bread in a consistent way, you need to control it. Now, the German way of making sourdough is, and the sourdough in Germany, German bakeries, is actually used in order to acidify the rye bread. Because when you make rye bread, you need a certain level of acidity in order to stop the enzymatic activity in the rye flour and allow the bread to be baked. And when it's baked, when you slice it, that the slices do not stick together. Mm-hmm. Now, in order to control that, German bakeries, they work with what we call Anstellgut. And Anstellgut is a starter that they use to mix with flour and water. They ferment for 18 hours at a certain temperature, and then they have their mature sourdough that they use in the production. That's how they try to regulate the sourdough. Now, bigger bakeries, and that's our reason of existence. Bakeries want to have a consistent bread production. Sourdough fermentation is an art of, you need to master that art. And when you do that at home, you can do whatever you want. When I make my sourdough at home, I don't care too much. The only thing that I want is that my wife and my kids say, "Papa, the bread was nice." Not that they say, today it's a bit acid, because that happens. When I'm a bit lazy, my bread gets acid. Now, to regulate that in bigger bakeries or even in small bakeries, they use ready-to-use sourdoughs, where you have, and that's what we produce here in different kind of forms, ready-to-use sourdoughs. They can be liquid. First of all, we produce sourdough. So it is a living sourdough, like you would do it homemade, just liquid, because it needs to be pumpable. And it needs to be transported at 4 degrees to preserve the lactic acid bacteria and the yeasts inside. Second step is that we can pasteurize, and then bakers benefit from the acidity that is present in the sourdough. and the flavor that has been developed. Because when we do that process here, we ferment for about 48 hours, which no sourdough is fermenting for 48 hours before you start to bake. So we go to the extremity of fermentations. We push the boundaries in order to unleash all the aromatical components, all the benefits you can get from the flour in order to contribute to the flavor of the bread. That's what large bakeries are doing. They buy our sourdough in order to bring more flavor in the bread. A third way is to dry the product. If you want to export it worldwide, you dry the sourdough like you dry milk powder. And the factory we have here previously was a dairy factory where the farmers of the region brought the milk to be converted into milk powder. When you have a liquid sourdough and you evaporate the water, what remains is a sourdough powder. Is that a sourdough? It was a sourdough. It's converted into sourdough powder, and it contains flavor components that are concentrated. And the way you dry, you can spray it with a very gentle heating, or you can drum dry it, where you evaporate the water on a hot surface, and then you can compensate with roasted and with toasted flavors. And as such, we offer a range of sourdough products that are actually allowing bakeries to create their signature flavor and to give some specific flavors. That's how larger bakeries use sourdough in order to increase the flavor of the bread.
And looking at an industrial production facility where, let's say, they would knead the dough, shape the dough, and bake it, is it even realistically possible if you have a live sourdough starter to do something like that? Or is that very hard? Because
definitely. Well, there is examples. I think that we have to make the distinction between, or forget talking about artisan bread and industrial bread.
Okay.
For me, that is history. Industrial bakeries, their dream is to make artisan breads. They have people who are thinking day in, day out, how are we going to produce artisan breads? And they do that for many years. The equipment manufacturers, they have understood this request. So the future of bakery will not be about artisans versus industrial bread, but it will be slow against fast bread. Some artisan bakers, they make bread in 3 hours, but they sell it as artisan bread. And some industrials, they make slow bread. I know customers of us, they make, when they start the line, it takes 72 hours before the bread comes out of the oven. You see? So it's a wrong idea to think that industrial bread is always bad and artisan bread is always good. No. It's the way you produce it. And industry has finally understood how to make artisan bread and to make it very good. When I was a kid, I'm 50 years old, when I was 10 years old and I went to the bakery, I had the choice out of 3 breads, artisan breads, and those were the best breads. Because if you went to the supermarket and you bought bread, that was the most shittiest bread you could imagine. But today, if I send, my children are already now 25 and 27, when I send them to the supermarket, to the baker, they have a big choice of breads, which is nice, but again, it's not always the best bread. And when I send them to the supermarket, I know that there is very nice breads in the supermarket that people can buy. And that is what we believe as a big company, we contribute to, that everybody has access to good bread, that not everybody is living at 50 meters from a small artisan baker who has a sourdough running and who is talking about making this bread in a beautiful way. Some people just do not have access to that. What we try is to share the knowledge and offer products that allow big bakeries, small bakeries, step away from this fast bread and go to that slow bread. That is our aim. That is what we are working for.
Okay, that's super interesting. And Karl, I found this amazing video footage from you. I'm going to put it up on the screen right here.
Okay. I have a bad memory for that. It's somewhere, it's in Turkey. Our bakery. Only women. No men in that bakery. It was the mother with her aunt, with her sister actually, and the daughters who were running that bakery with 2 wood-fired ovens, making amazing bread with a sourdough that they create. They call it idrilis or something. And it is the first day of spring. And they go on the wheat fields in the morning, and from the top of the wheat chalks, they collect the dew. And with that dew, like a fruit water, with that dew that is infected with microorganisms, they create the sourdough.
That's amazing. Did you take a little bit of that sourdough starter back to the library?
I have the sourdough here in the library, yes.
And so you're traveling the world and you're collecting sourdoughs from all around the world.
Yes, I do.
What
I'm
has
a
been
bastard.
what has been some of the craziest sourdough experience you had worldwide when collecting a sourdough?
There is Mexico. I was in Mexico in a bakery in Guadalajara, where Don Fernando del Rio Bakery, in the area in Guadalajara is renowned for what they call the birote bread. And birote is a typical crusty bread that they use to make torta ahogada. I have a video of that on YouTube, where they dip the bread into tomato sauce because the crust is so hard, but dipping it in tomato sauce makes it nice in combination with carnitas. And that sourdough is refreshed in summertime once a week. So they refresh it every day, but once a week. The sourdough gets a special meal, and that is they use beer, lime, and eggs. That was a crazy combination I'd never seen before.
That's amazing.
Really amazing. And then I had a sourdough from Japan. I will take it so that people can see it. And that sourdough was actually created by Mr. Kimura back in 1875 as one of the last samurai. When the emperor was taking all the power, all these samurai were out of business, and they started to convert themselves into craftsmen, carpenters, fishermen, bakers. And this Mr. Kimura had learned the art of sourdough baking from a Westerner, and we don't know if it was Portuguese, a Dutch, or an American. We don't know, but he learned how to make sourdough. Only he was not happy with the flavor. He didn't like the flavor, and he had a friend who was making sake. And sake is a rice fermentation. Now, I don't know if you can see that, but inside this sourdough, there is no flour, but only cooked rice.
So it's a gluten-free starter.
This is a gluten-free starter. Yeah, it's made with cooked rice. It has a very typical flavor, different than the rest of the sourdoughs here. So that is an amazing story. Is there anything else? Well,
I have one question here from Bikash, and so what I like to do is I like to take my sourdough with me while I'm traveling. So my sourdough starter bread pit has already been in, I think, 7 or 8 different countries, and I've always been feeding bread pit local flour wherever I travel to. Do you think that makes sense, or is that just doesn't make any sense?
Well, there is 2 ways of looking at it: the rational way and the emotional way. My emotional way would say, take it with you. Take it with you and let it live. Feed it with different stuff. It will only make it richer. It will make your story better. It will make your emotional connection with it better. Now, for the contribution, feeding it with different flours is no guarantee that your sourdough is going to change. For the simple reason, we have done an experiment in the summer 2019. We have collected, 2018. We have asked 15 bakers, 8 home bakers that I selected on social media, and 7 professional bakers. I knew they had a sourdough at home, and I've sent them a bag of flour with the question, okay, here is the flour. It was a package with small tubes to take samples. So I asked them to take samples from their sourdough day one before starting to feed it. And then they had it to feed it during 10 days, every day with my flour. Everybody got the same flour, a stone ground Belgian wheat flour, and take samples. And we have analyzed these samples, and we've seen that after 10 days of feeding with a different flour, there was no change.
So there was no change, meaning the microorganisms were still the original ones, or they were just...
The families, the consortium of microorganisms that was present in the sourdough at day one was still there day 10. Okay? And that's for the simple reason that you see sometimes these comments about the sourdough library where people say, no, if you open the jar of a sourdough in another place, it's changed. But that is utterly bullshit. That is impossible to do because you have in here, there's trillions of microorganisms that have created their environment like a city. I don't know where you live. Where do you live in Germany?
In the north, in Hamburg.
Hamburg, good example. Hamburg today and Hamburg 1,000 years ago. Hamburg was still Hamburg. What happened is that some families who were there 1,000 years ago are still there. But new ones have come in. That can happen over time. But it's not like in one day that Hamburg is changing.
That's a good example.
It takes years to change a city, and the walls will always remain. And the only way in the past to conquer a city was to siege it, was to starve the population so that they surrender, and then you could invade the city with new people. In a sourdough, if you neglect the sourdough, if you don't feed it, if you don't take care of it, if you let it starve, yes, then it's easy to change the life in a sourdough. But if your sourdough is healthy, if it's well fed, if the population of microorganisms is in optimal conditions, it's damn hard to change the properties of a sourdough. And here in the library, we feed the starters with the original flour. So I do have, besides the collection of sourdoughs, I also have a collection of flours, because sourdough number 78, he gets 6 different types of flour to be fed with. Number 53 is with 3 types of flour. So it's not that simple. And what we try to do here is to understand this impact and what is actually changing. Now, in 2020, we wanted to do an experiment and invite 2 bakers who deposited their sourdough in 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, to bring their sourdough back to the library, the one they have currently in their bakery, to compare with what we have today in the library and check how that relates to the original analysis we've done when the sourdough entered in the library. But COVID has, not made that possible, but it is definitely on our wish list. And when we can do it, we will do that, because that will give us, again, a lot of information, because we don't know how a sourdough is evolving in a bakery. We think we have the same, you think your sourdough remains the same, but that's not a guarantee. This is stuff that, thanks to the library, we can investigate.
It's super interesting. In Germany, for instance, we have some breweries in Bavaria which started brewing in 700. And so they have been using the same leftovers from one brewing process to the next one. So over 1,000 years, they have created super yeast, which is really good at fermenting beer. And now, you said that we pretty much lost the sourdough for almost 150 years, right?
Yes.
So we pretty much broke that old chain that we had from making sourdough for a relatively long time. It would be interesting to know how the sourdough is going to work in 500 years from now on.
If I would have a crystal ball or like a time machine, I would love to go and see. We will have to live with it. What we do know today is that we still have excellent sourdoughs around. I have here sourdough number 104 is from, in the meantime, it became a friend from Will Grant in Seattle. This sourdough dates back to the Klondike Gold Rush. And we found 3 types of yeast and 6 types of lactic acid bacteria. Where in some French sourdoughs that were created 20 years ago, we only find 1 lactic acid bacteria and 1 yeast. So finding these old sourdoughs that are in families for generations, that's what we are looking for. That's what we are looking for. So I have this website, the Quest for Sourdough. Perhaps you can put in the link in your YouTube channel.
Will do.
Where I ask people to register their starter online, so that at least I am aware that it exists. And these are all potential candidates to enter in the library one day.
Interesting. I took a note, so I'm going to place that in the description of the video to everybody later on if you want to double check that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
There's another follow-up question from Jan Peter, and I think that's a great question. If you feed your sourdough with a different mix of flours for a longer period, will it change its character, and will that influence the flavor of the bread? Similar to the siege question or the siege explanation you had. Yes. What do you think?
Well, if you feed it with a different kind of flour for a long time, little by little you will change the properties and you might change the families. Yes, probably. We have done the tests for 10 days. We have never experimented in over 50 days. That we haven't done. This is still something we could do. We just need time and resources to do that. But this is stuff we would like to investigate, definitely.
One question which I had was, what's your favorite sourdough starter? Out of all those that you have, do you have one that you like the most?
Let's say that I have no favorite, but the one that I showed you already, number 43, this very first sourdough I saw in my life. They always say the first one you never forget. First kiss or first whatever, you do not forget. So with this one, it's not my favorite, but by far it's the one which I have the most affection to, because I have a special relationship with this one. But there is starter that when I am feeding them, every 2 months I feed them. So when I feed them, I know who is behind. And I know that with some of these people, I have amazing experiences. We build a friendship relation. And so, yeah, for some, I have nice memories when I start feeding them. But no favorite.
There's a really good question from Void Removed, a subscriber of the channel. So I asked everybody to submit a few questions, and his question was pretty much, what if you were to mix all your sourdough starters, which you currently have in your library, into one starter to create the super starter? Have you thought about that?
Yes, I did it.
What happened?
I've done it already. Oh, look, I have here. I didn't know this question was going to come, but I have here something. So look, we have in each jar, there is about 500 grams. Okay. When I feed the starters, I only need 20 grams to start with, because I build up again until I have 500. So the 480 grams remaining, I have here a sourdough mix. I have a machine to make sourdough, actually. So we fill up the tank with all the sourdoughs. We combine them all together. They are mixed, yeah? And then I haven't done any baking trial with them, because these are starters that have been unfed, kept for 2 months, so they are starving. There is no fermentation power or very little fermentation power. So I didn't try to bake with it, but what I do is I have this video on the Quest for Sourdough website, how to make fleur de levain. When people have discard, they can convert it into a fantastic ingredient. And what I do is I spread this sourdough mixture of all of them. I spread it out on parchment paper and I bake it in the oven. I dry it actually at 100 degrees. It remains there for almost 24 hours. And then the sourdough is completely dry. And then I use like a cutter, like a Magimix or a Kenwood or a robot cutter with the big knife, cuts it into small pieces, and then I put them through like these mock mill flour mills, and that gives me what I call fleur de levain. So it is delicate sourdough powder, which has an amazing flavor, which has a unique taste. And I used this at the end of last year. Everyone, all the people who have a sourdough in the library, and some of our customers who visited us here over the last 10 years, got a little jar like this of this very unique sourdough powder in order to keep it as a collector item, or in order to flavor something, because this you can use when you make pizza. Instead of flour to make your pizza, you use this as a dusting flour. And what happens is that due to the level of acidity, when you eat your pizza, you immediately tickle the taste buds and you create more saliva. And when you make more saliva, you just increase the flavor of what you are eating.
Wow, Karl, that's such an amazing idea to use the discard starter to make this powder and just use that to enhance the flavor of whatever food you're making. This is really, really, really cool. Do you think I could get my hands on a mixture of all those 150 sourdough starters at some point?
Well, look, I do not own the starter.
Okay.
So we are a commercial company. We sell sourdough, but this is sourdough that we created, like we started 25 years ago, more than 25 years ago, long before we started to collect these sourdoughs. So these sourdoughs here, they are not there for commercial purpose. We use them to study sourdoughs, protect the biodiversity. Some of these sourdoughs are now part of research in universities according to the digestibility of bread. So I cannot decide whether I give away these starters. Okay, it's not something I will start doing it. A librarian does not give away the books. Yeah. Well, here I'm not entitled to just give them away because they do not belong to us.
Makes sense. And I guess that also was another question from Malini. Thank you so much, Malini. Can you buy samples from your library?
No, impossible.
I imagine just having a website, seeing 200 starters.
Maybe what is possible is that if PhD students, if bioengineers, everybody that wants to study sourdough can get in contact with us in order to get some of the samples to be part of this study. That is what the library is for. For scientists, this is like the holy grail because you have everything here documented, and it's there. It's there to use for scientific studies.
That's amazing. I do have another follow-up question because you already answered what's your favorite starter, so that's super interesting. Which characteristics should a sourdough starter have for you? What are you looking at? Which characteristics should it have?
Okay, I'm going to give my personal opinion, but that is purely me. There's many other opinions. Seeing the variety of sourdoughs here, these are not all sourdoughs that are where I say like, wow, yeah. I'm not wowed by all these starters on a personal note about taste, about acidity, about the way they are. For me, my starter, at home I have two starters. One that is coming from Altamura that I collected there. I got it from a baker that when I visited Altamura back in 2013. And another one I created together with Martina Gönemann a couple of years ago when she was writing a book about sourdough, a German writer. And one is more a whole wheat flour starter, and the other one is a durum wheat starter. Now, what I try to do with these starters is to keep the acidity low, because my wife and my kids don't like it when the bread is acid. I'm looking for a lot of fermentation power, so I keep these starters not liquid. They are like semi-stiff, like you see a lot of sourdoughs here in my bag from Italy. They have this consistency. They are firm sourdoughs. Whenever you have a liquid sourdough, you just shout out to increase the level of acidity. When you keep your sourdough stiff, you reduce the production of lactic acids and you favorize the production of yeasts. So
super interesting.
for me, my starter, I prefer it firm, stiff, drier, not too liquid, because I'm just not fond of acidity.
So by adjusting the liquid, you can change the level of acidity that your starter is producing.
In a liquid starter, you have much more transportation of the starches. The enzymatic activity is higher, so everything is accelerated, and it's just like a rave for the microorganisms that are in there. When you have a stiff sourdough, everything goes slower. The yeast has more oxygen in the beginning to protect itself, and so you favorize the yeasts in a stiff starter. The Italians, they all have these stiff starters because they don't like acidity in their bread.
It's super interesting that you mentioned this, because I was recently making a spontaneously fermented bread dough, where I would just make a starter which had very, very, very high hydration. I think it must have been maybe 500% or so. And without refreshing, I was able to build the starter in 3 or 4 days and then use that to bake a bread out of it. It was so much faster than the traditional method of using, 1-to-1 flour-water ratio.
But again, it depends on the type of flour you've used, because it's your flour that is containing the microorganisms. So you can try tomorrow with another flour that is coming from somewhere else, and you might have completely the opposite. So
now, I think you answered this already. Is there a way to boost the CO2 production of the starter, tweaking the bacterial yeast ratio? So Absolutely. Your recommendation would be to make the starter a little bit stiffer?
Stiffer. So what I do, when my starter has been in the fridge for a couple of weeks, let's say, I bake normally every weekend or every 2 weeks. But sometimes it happens that I'm abroad or I don't have time. And then I take my starter from the fridge and I feed it 3 times with 4 to maximum 6 hours in between. And I make it stiff, stiff, very hard, and I keep it in water. So the acids that are produced during the fermentation are diluted in the water, and because there's always the fight between the yeasts and the lactic acid bacteria. They fight for the same food, and at a certain moment they do with the white flag. They say, okay, now let's live in peace together. But depending on the conditions, you might if you keep your fermentation of your starter below 8 hours, you favorize the yeasts. It's after 8 hours that the balance between the yeasts and the lactic acid bacteria is like vulnerable. That's the moment where the lactic acid bacteria take over and become dominant and start acidifying more and more the sourdough starter, and your yeast starts to die. So you do not have any benefit from the yeasts when you use a starter that is older than 8 hours. So feed your starter 4 to 6 hours with a maximum of 8 hours, and you will increase tremendously the fermentation power. Keep it in water, which is the metodo piemontese. It's from Piemonte in Italy, where you keep your starter in water to get rid of the acidity. Now, don't keep it longer than a week without feeding, because otherwise it will be diluted in the water.
That's super interesting. I have one more follow-up question. Just looking at the time, it has already been so much fun. I think I would have probably 200 more questions. But one thing I wanted to ask...
Let's schedule one every month. We do that every month.
That would be
fun.
Amazing.
I like to share knowledge like this.
So this is a question of mine. What about colder temperatures? Does it change the flavor? Because some recipes or some sourdough bakers are saying, if you proof the final dough inside of the fridge, the flavor is going to be enhanced. Me personally, maybe I'm just a German and I don't have so good taste buds. I've never noticed a difference in terms of taste. What is your take on that?
Again, you don't know what kind of starter they are using. They might have a completely different starter than what you have. What we do know is that when you lower the temperature, now I don't know what these colder temperatures, what is it? Is it 20 degrees? Is it 15 degrees? Or is it 5 degrees?
5 degrees, I would say.
Yeast stops its activity when it's -2. So as long as you are above -2, your yeasts will produce gas, will produce alcohol and these esters. So the small flavor components that contribute to the flavor. Okay. On the other hand, the colder it is, the less active your lactic acid bacteria become. Temperatures below 20 degrees, they do not like. So when you go cold, you go definitely to favorize the yeasts, and you develop what the yeast can develop as a contribution. We know that the colder it gets, the longer you have to ferment. The longer you ferment, the more flavor components you develop. So there is like this correlation, but it depends which kind of yeast is present in my starter. What is your yeast in your starter? And what was this person who said that? What do they have in their yeast? It might be a Torulaspora del Bruchi, or it might be a Kazakhstania humilis, or a Wesela, or whatever. So very, very difficult to say.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I think it also explains, so the city of Pilsen in the Czech Republic, that's where they discovered the Pilsner style of brewing, and it was very cold in the caves, but the yeast was still working. Karl, it seems your microphone might be currently off. Maybe the battery is empty.
We switch. Do you hear me now?
A little bit of a robotic voice from you.
Yeah, because I had this road, but did like a webinar with Costa Rica. Yeah.
No worries, Karl. I'm just looking. I'm looking at the time anyway, and it has been almost an hour. So it has been such an amazing time. Thank you so much for answering all the questions. I'll be sharing the link to your Instagram, to your website, and the Quest for Sourdough also inside of the description. And let's definitely do this again one time. And I would also so much love to visit you in the library once this COVID thing is a little bit better.
Well, you can. You're more than welcome here. It's fun to do. I always love. People have questions, yeah, they can always find. Thanks for having me in your episode of you, Bob. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Have a great evening.
Have a great evening. Bye.